From the nation's capital, the Conservative Caucus presents Conservative Roundtable, an in-depth look at today's most important issues.
Welcome to Conservative Roundtable. I'm Howard Phillips. My guest for this broadcast is Ken Boehm, who is the director of the National Legal and Policy Center. We're going to be talking about one of the most expensive, counterproductive, unconstitutional programs ever conceived by the federal government. It's called the Legal Services Corporation. Let me confess that I have a conflict of interest. I wrote a veto message for Richard Nixon, killing the idea of a legal services corporation when it was first proposed by Senator Walter Mondale and Senator Alan Cranston back in 1971. Subsequently, I was unsuccessful in my attempt to persuade President Nixon to veto legislation to create the corporation, which he signed into law in July of 1974, shortly before he left office. As director of the U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity, the then Office of Legal Services was under my direction. And I came to see firsthand how this program, which purportedly was established to gain poor people access to our system of justice, was in fact a nationwide network of left-wing legal activists. Ken, how did you get involved in the legal services issue?
Got involved because while the Reagan board was still in charge of Legal Services Corporation, I ended up working over there as head of their Office of Policy Development. Prior to that, I really hadn't known that much about it, except that I know it had a reputation for being very activist. Reagan, of course, tried to end legal services. He didn't have the votes. The Democrats
I would dispute how hard he tried. He put a zero in the budget,
right?
But he then signed budgets that had it in there because he was unwilling to make it a decisive issue.
And it was never made a top priority issue, and it continued to exist at a low level. Its budget was cut a little bit, but then crept back up. And during the Bush years, they tried to reach some sort of non-aggression pact with legal services, hoping there'd be reforms that would make it less controversial. And as we know, reforms have never worked.
Let's talk about how it's structured.
Sure.
Many people, even in Congress, are confused about how this thing works. They have the image of a nice little local office where innocent poor people come in and say, I need a divorce, or I need to get my roof repaired, or whatever it may be, will you help me? But what people don't realize is we're talking about more than 300 separate corporations, each of which has its own board of directors, its own staff, and which in effect controls the money that it's given. And they have I don't know if it's still there, but I remember the mandate of the program used to include community education, group representation, law reform, and similar economic development, all of which were covers for political action. Group representation involved creating groups. Community education meant telling people about how good Marxism was, et cetera.
No, they not only created the groups and then used the groups as clients to sue the government to get more welfare, more money. You said one of the most expensive. You're absolutely right.
$2 trillion is what Peter Ferrara came up with as the cost of this program since its inception under Lyndon Johnson in 1963.
And they have actually, the legal services proponents brag about this. They say, yeah, $5 billion of taxpayer money directly. But when you look at lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit that they filed, plus every time they file a lawsuit, people have to pay legal fees and so forth. But usually what they were trying to do is law reform, which is get more welfare. In many cases, they try to get drug addicts into being a favored class under Americans with Disability Acts. They say somebody who is a drug addict really has a disability, so you can't fire them, you can't do this, you can't do that.
They've expanded SSI. I recall during the Ford administration, one of their so-called backup centers, the Food Research Action Center, had a lawsuit, and of course they can pick the judge. They can find a liberal judge who'll give them whatever they want. Many of the judges are alumni of the program. I remember they found a judge who gave them a ruling that Jerry Ford had to hire 18,000 outreach workers so that every person in America who wasn't on food stamps would be contacted and urged to go on the food stamp program.
Just figure the dollar total on that.
Absolutely.
I mean,
anyway, Peter Ferrara added it up. It came to $2 trillion. They've got lobbyists in almost every state legislature. It's not just a lawyer's program. They lobby, they litigate, they organize, They propagandize and they proselytize.
And beyond that, where do the poor people get? First of all, if a poor person walks in an office today, they have no right to those lawyers. The lawyers, not the poor people, not Congress, not rules. The lawyers pick which cases they'll handle and which cases they won't handle.
Because it's a staff attorney system, the power of purchase is invested in the provider rather than the consumer. The provider controls the supply, and since the supply is free, the demand is relatively unlimited, and the supplier determines which demand gets satisfied.
Right.
Another factor in the program, and you can add whatever you might know about the current situation, was that for many years they were paying dues with government money, not just to the American Bar Association, but to the communist-dominated National Lawyers Guild.
Correct. Correct.
Is that still going on?
That's now prohibited, but it's only recently prohibited, only since April of 1996. So it's only been less than a year now.
And, of course, many of the lawyers are themselves active left-wingers. National Lawyers Guild, which is a Marxist organization, and which has an extremely radical agenda, even more radical than the supposedly conservative American Bar Association.
Well, to give you an idea, the outgoing president, Mr. Forger, who just left office this week, flew out to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to have a dinner in honor of a National Lawyers Guild chairman out there. So even the current regime at Legal Services is still honoring this National Lawyers Guild, which, as you said, is very much a fringe legal group.
Well, it was characterized by the House Un-American Activities Committee as the, I believe it was the principal legal arm of the Communist Party of the United States.
And has spoken in support of Arab terrorist groups and everything else you can imagine being at that part
I recall
of the
one of the things they did during the period when I was watching them closely was participate in the organization of some 500 chapters of the National Welfare Rights Organization. They were involved with the Aztlán movement, trying to return portions of the Southwest to Mexico, Republic of New Africa, the communist-dominated American Indian movement. All of these things were being subsidized with the government money.
And speaking of the subsidy goes beyond that. It's impossible to name a liberal group or left-wing group in this country that hasn't benefited directly or indirectly from legal services representation. When there's a lawsuit coming up, a National Organization for Women, American Civil Liberties Union, the various environmental groups and so forth, need an ally, it's not too hard for legal services to go pluck a person out of their waiting room as a plaintiff in a case. And to give you an idea, the welfare reform law in New Jersey, which had been sponsored by a black liberal Democrat who felt that welfare was broken, was put into effect. It was being challenged by three different groups. One of them was Legal Services of New Jersey, the other was National Organization for Women, and the third was the American Civil Liberties Union. The point I'd make is if the ACLU and National Organization for Women, those are both affluent groups, ACLU takes in $35–40 million a year through their various affiliated groups, have the money to challenge the welfare reform, why should your tax dollars and my tax dollars subsidize ACLU and a feminist organization?
And of course they've operated through their own network of public interest law firms. Of course every legal services project is in some sense a public interest law firm. But they've had these major national public interest law firms. One of them was called some time ago the Harvard Center on Law and Education. This was run by Marion Wright Edelman, Hillary Rodham's buddy, and it was heavily involved in challenging the whole concept of parental accountability in education. It was pushing the concept of student rights and children's rights and so forth against parental authority and other legitimate authority. It was pushing quotas. It was pushing the tracking system. And the irony was that Richard Nixon kept refunding them. I kept defunding them. But people at the White House with whom they had a close relationship kept overruling me and giving them the money back. And then when Hillary Rodham became head of the Legal Services Program, programs like that were riding high.
And really still are. They've taken a budget cut, but last year they actually went up. You have a Republican Congress in control. They went from $278 million last year to $283 million this year.
Let's look at the issue of abortion. Talking about client shopping, there was a story in the paper recently about how the woman who was used in the as the plaintiff in Doe v. Bolton,
Right, the companion case to Roe v. Wade,
claimed that she did not want an abortion.
Right.
She was coerced by a legal services lawyer into having an abortion, so they could use her in this case.
Right, classic case. She was in the waiting room. She had another legal problem. I believe it was a custody problem with other children. They, in effect, said, if you want the one, you'll do the other. And so she had misgivings afterwards. She was not pro-abortion at the time, and she's since spoken out. But they do that constantly. They do that to this day.
You know, there are members of Congress who think that you can solve the problem by placing restrictions. Right. But there's no way any regulation I've ever seen has confined them. Right now, there are restrictions against abortion activity, but they're still doing it.
They do abortion. They've been doing that for years. For years, their big loophole is whatever was restricted with federal funds was not restricted with outside funds. But since you couldn't see their case files and they didn't keep time records, you never knew which money they were using. And so consequently, they did whatever they wanted, how they wanted.
And then there's the IOLTA scam where they put their client funds in trust accounts and then can use that.
Yeah.
And then if all else fails, they say it's part of their outside practice of law that they did it in their free time.
Yeah, there was an interesting case. Texas Rural Legal Assistance is one of the more radical programs, had a number of its lawyers down in Mexico organizing with the union movement down there, a fairly radical movement. And when there were press accounts, they said, oh, we're doing our vacation time here. Who's to know? There are folks at Texas Rural Legal were not going to call them on account of that. And the folks in Washington Legal Services Corporation all are representatives of the field program. They are one and the same. So,
well, Ken, we're going to have to take a break. When we come back, in the spirit of David Letterman, I'm going to give you the chance to review your top 10 outrages for legal services.
Okay.
You have a minute to think about it.
Okay.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with Ken Boehm of the National Legal and Policy Center. Hello, I'm Howard Phillips. The Conservative Caucus has been actively fighting since 1974 for less expensive government and lower taxes imposed upon the American people by the federal government. If you want to become part of our effort to reduce the size and cost and regulatory burden of the federal government, I hope you will call the number shown on your screen.
For more information about the Conservative Caucus, write us at 450 Maple Avenue East, Vienna, Virginia 22180, or call 703-938-9626. Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips with our guest, Ken Boehm, the chairman of the National Legal and Policy Center. We've been talking about the Legal Services Corporation, which you pay for with your tax dollars. Ken, you've had time to think. What are the top 10 horror stories? Or it may not be the top 10. Give us 10.
I'll give you 10. I'll start with one that's taking place right now in Texas. Just 2 months ago, Texas Rural Legal Aid, one of the bigger legal services program, sued to overturn the results of election in Valverde County, a county bordering Mexico. 2 Republicans were elected, the first 2 Republicans in the county's history, I'm told, sheriff and commissioner. They voted to turn out the Republicans from office by invalidating 800 ballots from military absentee voters and their families.
You say they voted to?
They not voted to, I'm sorry. They filed an action in federal court saying that the votes from the 800 military were invalid because they didn't have adequate residency. Well, you know, our laws recognize that military have to go where their country sends them. Some of these folks were over in Bosnia. And it has just created a backlash down there. The fact that they're trying to invalidate 800 military signatures has resulted into legislation being introduced in Texas, in the Senate, in the House.
I understand that the congressman from that district had been a supporter of legal services, one of the Republicans who backed it, Henry Bonilla.
Congress Henry Bonilla.
And he's now at a change of opinion.
He now knows what legal services does with that tax money he voted to give them. And so that's a big horror story. It's a recent one. There's some individual smaller horror stories that are just as horrible. There's a case in Pennsylvania very recently where a rapist, a juvenile delinquent with a long history of violence, was in prison. He had actually raped a 13-year-old who gave birth to a child. The child was put up with for adoption with the Lutheran Home there, a local charity, and legal services, believe it or not, while he's still incarcerated, decided that they were going to get custody rights for this man.
For the rapist.
For the baby. Now, never mind, he had never seen him. The psychiatrist said he was a danger to any small child or anyone else. His parole officer said he was bad and getting worse. They forced the Lutheran Home into a 3-day trial. The judge threw it out. The jury took no time at all, and the judge basically threw it out. But they spent taxpayer money to try to get custody of a child for a rapist. That, unfortunately, is not an isolated instance. They've done other cases out in the Midwest. There was a family that adopted an Indian child. It was a result of an unwed mother who I believe was not Indian. The father was Indian. Neither parents wanted the child. The child was put up for adoption. The farm family adopted him. When the child was several years old, they brought a legal action to force the custody of the child, not to the parents who didn't want it, the natural-born parents, but to the Indian tribe, saying they had violated a federal Indian law, and therefore this little child, who had already bonded with the new family, should be returned. The family had to fight it to such a degree that they lost their home, they spent their life savings, and it was just a real sad case. The child, I'm happy to report, is with the adoptive parents. But again, legal services spent tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars, and this poor family had to spend quite a bit. Some of the more horrible cases, because even though they can't do criminal law, are the cases where they keep drug dealers in public housing. There are literally hundreds of these cases around the country, including major ones, where, for example, in New York City, the Public Housing Authority was having a problem with drugs in public housing. And drugs bring in crime, violence, and the rest of it. The tenants, there's 500,000 tenants in New York public housing, through their tenants association, agreed with their landlord, Public Housing Authority, that they needed to expedite the evictions. Evictions were taking 2 years to get these drug types out. Who came to the aid of the drug dealers but legal services in New York? They went and said, oh, no, you have to have a long series of hearings. You have to have procedural due process and so forth. And the point that the critics, myself included, have made is, who are they representing? The 500,000 poor people who want the drug criminals out, or the drug criminals? And the answer was, of course, the drug criminals. That case has been repeated in city after city. Back when the Housing Urban Development wanted to get drug dealers out of public housing, they came up with an expedited way of doing that to cut the red tape to get the dealers out fast. Legal services went into federal court here in Virginia to stop it, and they were able to stop it on some procedural grounds. Not too far away from here in Alexandria, same thing. There was a police officer killed when going into a public housing unit which was infested with drugs. Legal services went to the rescue to prevent the evictions. There's now you said restrictions don't work. You're absolutely right. There's a restriction now against that type of case. However, there's loopholes, and lawyers know a loophole when they see it. So after the restrictions went into effect April last year, there have been case after case. There are cases in New York because the law, the restriction, is very mild-mannered. It says you can only not represent the actual drug dealer. Never mind if the drug dealer's family is in the unit, profited from, knew about the drug dealing. You can't. You're allowed to continue to represent them. So they're doing those types of cases. All around the country, in virtually every situation you can name where there's been an ideological battle going on, legal services weighed in. They've weighed in favor of gay rights because all they have to do is find a poor gay person who is, for example, trying to get gay marriages recognized when it comes to rental units, for example, in New York, and they have a case. Now, supposedly, they just picked that off the street, but they systematically are only involved on one side. You never see them arguing against gay rights, only for gay rights.
So, in other words, only politically correct poor people or sought out to be
They're
clients.
not an equal opportunity legal services program. We challenged them at one point. I've been in various debates with the various legal services leaders, Mr. Eakley, the chairman, Mr. Forger, the president, and so forth. We challenged them. Name a case where they've helped a homeschooler who's had a legal problem. Name a case where there's a poor gun owner who maybe Second Amendment rights were violated. Name a case where it's been a school prayer situation and a poor family needed a lawyer. Name a case where there's been a union member who was beset upon by his union and maybe his Beck rights weren't honored. Name a single case. Well, they do something like 1.5, 1.6 million cases a year. And in debates, I say, name one. They can't name one. Not a single one. And when you multiply that by 20-plus years of a program, 1 million-plus cases a year.
Now, over the years, they've also defined convicted felons as poor people.
Yes.
And a significant amount of federal tax dollars have been used or has been used to represent these poor murderers and rapists in their efforts to get pornography and color television sets and so forth in the prisons. I remember when Angela Davis was active, the Communist Party of California was a major beneficiary of legal services activity in the prisons.
No, they've done that for years. It wasn't until just last year that they couldn't represent prisoners. Now, these aren't prisoners getting criminal lawyers. That's a Sixth Amendment right. But you don't have a Sixth Amendment right to a free civil lawyer to sue people. And so what they would do is they go into the prisons. It's part of their organizational commitment that they have. And they would sue for better living conditions. In one Ohio case, it was the ping pong tables weren't adequate. They didn't have enough paddles and so forth. And these are the cases that they would take. Convicted felons, they've done that time and time again. In some cases, illegal aliens who were caught in drug crimes.
Well, of course, they've been heavily involved in ballot issues, and we're gradually reaching that list of 10. Certainly in California, it was legal services who were in the forefront of efforts to overturn the will of the people of California when they passed Prop 187.
Exactly.
CRLA, the Western Center on Law and Poverty, others were involved. And over the years, legal services lawyers have been named to top positions in the federal and state judiciaries, so the lawyers have known to which judge to present their arguments.
And now that the First Lady, as you pointed out earlier, is a former chairman in the Clinton administration, there have been federal judges named, there have been people throughout the Justice Department, people throughout the whole administration.
We're talking about, what, 6,000 full-time lawyers?
Yeah, approximately.
Roughly, and another 20 or 25,000 support personnel.
Right.
I mean, this is an army. This is an army of people who are working to change the laws of this country, the culture of this country, the economy of this country, without any accountability either to the marketplace or to the political process. And the irony is that people who present themselves as conservative Republicans, like Bill McCollum of Florida and Robert Goodlatte of Virginia and others of similar ilk, are giving the money to this radical left-wing operation to buy themselves a little bit of political peace.
Right. They get lobbied by their friends in the American Bar Association, and they do it. And when people say, I've had congressmen tell me back when it was $400 million, it's only $400 million. And I remember telling a congressman, do you know what the Republican Party spent in the last cycle? This is the 94 election cycle. The Democratic Party spent, and all political parties spent together, all political action committees spent together, it was less than $400 million.
Judge Bill Harvey, a former chairman of the Legal Services Corporation, made the point that the legal services program, thanks to federal tax dollars, was the most powerful political party in the United States of America. More than the Democrats, more than the Republicans. It had more money to spend, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars.
With no fundraising costs because Congress gives it to them in one big check.
And operating in the state legislatures, having an impact on how federal grants go. They call it economic development, but it really means using their network of contacts to secure federal funds, contracts, and grants for ideologically allied organizations.
Time and time again. Yeah, as I say, we've been documenting the cases for some time now. There's no shortage, I hate to say. Every time we do a nexus search on a legal services program, we find horror stories. They said, it's a minority. Most of their money goes for the big cases, the class actions and so forth, which are now prohibited, but they've gotten some end runs around them. And the big cases are always political. It's hard to find a big case that's class action suit, an impact suit, that's not political.
We have to take a break. We haven't even talked about what they've done to destroy private property rights, American agriculture, many other things. We'll have to cover that ground when we come back right after this break. Please stay with us. Hi, I'm Howard Phillips, Chairman of the Conservative Caucus. I'm inviting you to learn more about the Conservative Caucus, a grassroots public policy action organization that was founded in 1974. Whether you're opposed to socialized medicine, interested in making Congress more accountable, stopping the New World Order, fighting gun control, reducing taxes, or restoring America to its biblical premises and constitutional boundaries, we're the organization you're looking for. Please call the number on your screen to get more information about our work.
For more information, write the Conservative Caucus, 450 Maple Avenue East, Vienna, Virginia, 22180, or call 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. This is Howard Phillips. We've been privileged to have as our guest Ken Boehm, Chairman of the National Legal and Policy Center. We've been talking about legal services. Of course, the old story, Ken, is that when there's only one lawyer in town, business is terrible. When there are two lawyers, business is terrific. But with 6,000 legal services lawyers, it's much too good. And, of course, the whole legal services program is, in effect, a way for members of the bar to avoid their pro bono responsibilities.
That's right.
Say, I don't have to do it. The taxpayers are footing the bill. Right. Go to that guy down the street.
I used to hear stories all the time when I worked at the corporation of a poor person will go in a lawyer's office, they say, I'm too poor, I can't afford it, but I know lawyers have to give a certain amount of duty to the poor to help them with their legal problems. It's professional responsibility. And they say, why don't you go see legal services? They're down the street. And so they used it as a way to get out of their professional responsibilities. It ginned up business for them because legal services lawyers are suing people all the time. And the ABA, which has been losing members in droves, knew that the taxpayer would pay all those ABA dues, $100, $200 a year, for the legal services lawyers.
Ken, before we end the show, I want to encourage everyone watching to write to your organization to get a copy of some of your reports. You've done a phenomenal research job, chapter and verse, spelling out some of these horrible abuses. How do people reach you?
They can write, we're in the book, it's National Legal and Policy Center.
NLPC.
NLPC, we're at 8321 Old Courthouse Road, Suite 270, and that's in Vienna, Virginia, 22182, Vienna, Virginia. And we'd be happy to send free information. We have lots of horror stories, examples, all current, all recent, all verified, of what legal services is doing with our money.
Well, we have about 30 seconds left. This is really a key year. We hear much talk about balancing the budget. If the Republicans are serious, they'll fight for a zero for legal services and save the taxpayers a great deal of money. Ken, congratulations on all you've been doing. We appreciate your being here. We thank you for joining us.